The fluorescent lights of Nashville International Airport cast their harsh glow across the crowded terminal as Kenny Rogers sat quietly in gate C12, his weathered hands folded over a well-worn paperback novel. At 77, he had learned the art of traveling incognito. A simple flannel shirt, faded jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his silver hair made him look like any other senior citizen waiting for a delayed flight. The anonymity was a blessing he'd come to treasure more than applause. Flight 447 to Denver had been delayed twice already, pushing Kenny's arrival time dangerously close to his evening commitment, a charity concert for deaf children at the Colorado School for the Deaf and Blind. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was running late for an event celebrating communication across barriers, while sitting in an airport where communication seemed to be breaking down all around him. As Kenny glanced up from his book, his attention was drawn to a disturbance near the gate counter. A young woman, perhaps in her early 30s, stood before the airline representative with obvious distress written across her delicate features. She held a crumpled boarding pass in one hand, while the other moved in urgent, graceful gestures that Kenny immediately recognized as sign language. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the kind of practical clothes that suggested someone who worked with her hands: dark jeans, a comfortable sweater, and sneakers that had seen many miles. The gate agent, a middle-aged man whose name tag read Robert, was shaking his head with the kind of professional sympathy that barely masked his growing impatience. Kenny could see the frustration building in both parties as they tried unsuccessfully to communicate across what seemed like an impossible gulf. "Ma'am, I've told you 3 times already," Robert was saying, his voice carrying the edge of someone who had dealt with too many difficult passengers in one shift. "The flight to Denver has been canceled due to severe weather. The earliest we can get you out is tomorrow afternoon on the 2:15 flight." The young woman's hands moved more frantically, her face flushing with what Kenny recognized as a mixture of panic and helplessness. She was clearly trying to explain something urgent, pointing to her ticket and then to her watch, but her attempts at vocalization came out unclear and distorted. The speech pattern Kenny had learned to recognize from deaf individuals who had been taught to speak but had never heard their own voices clearly. "Look, I don't have time for this," Robert continued, his patience visibly fraying. "If you can't understand English, you need to find an interpreter or someone who can help you. I have a line of other passengers to deal with." Kenny watched as the woman fumbled in her purse, pulling out a smartphone and frantically typing something. She showed the screen to Robert, who barely glanced at it before shaking his head again. The dismissiveness of the gesture made Kenny's jaw tighten with a familiar anger. The same feeling he'd experienced years ago when he'd watched his own mother struggle to make herself understood by impatient store clerks who couldn't be bothered to listen to her heavily accented English. The woman stepped aside, clearly defeated, and Kenny could see tears of frustration beginning to form in her eyes. She moved to an empty seat nearby and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that spoke louder than any words could have. Something deep in Kenny's chest stirred. Not the protective instinct of a celebrity used to being approached by fans, but the simple human impulse to help someone in distress. He set down his book, stood up with the careful movements of a man whose knees reminded him daily of his age, and walked over to where the young woman sat. "Excuse me, miss," Kenny said softly, positioning himself where she could see his face clearly. "I couldn't help but notice you're having some trouble with your flight situation. I don't speak sign language, but maybe I can help anyway." The woman looked up, startled by his approach. Her eyes were red-rimmed but intelligent, and Kenny could see her quickly assessing whether this stranger represented help or just another complication. After a moment's hesitation, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small notepad and pen, clearly tools she was accustomed to using for communication. She wrote quickly in neat, precise handwriting. "Thank you for stopping. My name is Emma. I'm deaf. My flight to Denver was canceled, and I need to get there tonight. My younger brother is having emergency surgery in the morning, and I'm supposed to be there to interpret for him. He's deaf too, and scared." Kenny felt his heart clench as he read the message. He looked back toward the gate counter, where Robert was now helping another passenger with the same dismissive efficiency he'd shown Emma. "Let me see what I can find out," Kenny wrote on the notepad, then approached the counter again. "Excuse me, Robert," Kenny said, reading the man's name tag and using the kind of respectful but firm tone he'd learned from decades of dealing with venue managers and concert promoters. "I'd like to help the young lady who was just here. Can you tell me exactly what options are available for getting to Denver tonight?" Robert looked up with the weary expression of someone who had explained the same thing too many times already. "Sir, like I told her, the flight is canceled due to weather. There's a storm system moving through Colorado that's shut down most air traffic in and out of Denver. The earliest flight we have available is tomorrow at 2:15. What about other airlines? Kenny asked. They're all dealing with the same weather, sir. And even if they weren't, everything's booked solid because of all the cancellations. Kenny nodded thoughtfully, then pulled out his phone. Would you mind if I made a few calls? Sometimes there are options that don't show up in the regular system. Robert shrugged with the indifference of someone who had seen it all. Knock yourself out, but I'm telling you, there's nothing flying into Denver tonight. Kenny returned to Emma and wrote on the notepad. The regular flights are all canceled, but I have some connections in the charter business. Would you mind if I tried to arrange something? Emma's eyes widened as she read his message. She wrote back, That's incredibly kind, but charter flights are expensive. I can't afford that kind of money. Let me worry about that for now, Kenny wrote. Tell me about your brother. As Kenny began making phone calls, Emma wrote out the story that had brought her to this desperate situation. Her brother David was 19, born deaf like Emma, and had been living independently in Denver while attending community college. That morning, he'd been rushed to the hospital with severe abdominal pain that turned out to be a rare condition requiring immediate surgery. David is terrified of hospitals, Emma wrote. He's never had surgery before, and he doesn't know anyone in Denver who can sign. I'm the only family he has. Our parents died in a car accident 3 years ago. The doctors need someone to interpret so they can explain the procedure and get proper consent. Kenny felt the weight of that responsibility as he dialed numbers on his phone. This wasn't just about a missed flight or an inconvenience. This was about a scared young man facing surgery alone, unable to communicate with the people who were supposed to help him. Over the next hour, Kenny worked his phone like a man possessed. He called his manager, several contacts in the music industry, charter services he'd used for tours, and even reached out to fellow musicians who might have connections in Denver. Emma sat beside him, watching in amazement as this stranger moved mountains on her behalf. During the waiting periods between calls, Kenny and Emma communicated through the notepad, and Kenny found himself learning sign language basics from smartphone apps. Emma was patient with his clumsy attempts, showing him simple signs and helping him understand the grammar that was so different from spoken English. Why are you helping me? Emma wrote during one of these quiet moments. You don't even know me. Kenny considered the question carefully before responding in writing. My mother used to say that we're all just walking each other home. Sometimes it's your turn to help, sometimes it's your turn to be helped. Today, it's my turn to help. Other passengers in the waiting area began to notice the unusual scene developing nearby. Here was this older gentleman in casual clothes, clearly not an airline employee, working tirelessly to help a young deaf woman he'd obviously just met. Some people whispered among themselves, a few recognizing Kenny's face but not quite placing where they knew him from. A middle-aged woman named Patricia approached them with her own notepad. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing. I'm a sign language interpreter, and if there's anything I can do to help with communication. Emma's face lit up with gratitude as she quickly signed her thanks. Patricia interpreted for Kenny. She says you're an angel, and she's never experienced such kindness from a stranger. Tell her we're not strangers anymore, Kenny replied. We're people helping each other through a difficult day. Finally, after what felt like hours but was actually about 2 hours, Kenny's persistence paid off. A small charter company in Nashville had a pilot willing to make an emergency flight to Denver, weather permitting. The storm system was expected to clear enough for a brief window of safe travel. When Kenny showed Emma the details, her face went through a series of emotions, relief, gratitude, and then panic as she saw the cost involved. I can't let you pay for this, she wrote frantically. This is thousands of dollars. I don't have that kind of money, and I can't let you spend yours on someone you just met. Emma, Kenny wrote back, money is just a tool. Right now, we need this tool to get you to your brother. We can figure out the rest later. But Emma shook her head firmly. I'm not a charity case. I work as a graphic designer. I pay my own way. If you can arrange this flight, I promise I'll pay you back, even if it takes me years. Kenny studied her face, seeing the pride and determination there, understanding that accepting what she perceived as charity would somehow diminish her sense of independence and self-worth. He thought for a moment, then wrote, What if we make it a business arrangement? I hire you to design something for me, and the payment happens to cover the cost of the flight. Emma looked puzzled, so Kenny continued. I've been wanting to update my website and promotional materials to be more accessible for deaf fans. You could design something that incorporates sign language elements, makes my concerts more welcoming to the deaf community. We'd be helping each other." It was a creative solution that preserved Emma's dignity while ensuring she got the help she needed. Emma considered this for a moment, then nodded and wrote, "Deal. But I do excellent work, so you'd better be prepared for the best website redesign you've ever seen." Kenny smiled. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As they made their way to the charter terminal, word had spread among the other delayed passengers about what had transpired. Several people approached Kenny, some recognizing him now, wanting to thank him for his kindness. But Kenny deflected the attention, focusing instead on making sure Emma had everything she needed for the journey ahead. At the charter terminal, as Emma prepared to board the small jet that would take her to her brother's bedside, she turned to Kenny with tears in her eyes. She signed something elaborate and beautiful, which Patricia interpreted. She says you've restored her faith in humanity, and that she'll never forget that when she needed help most, a stranger became a friend. Kenny watched the small plane disappear into the stormy evening sky, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with recognition or applause. This was the kind of moment that reminded him why he'd gotten into music in the first place. Not for fame or money, but for the human connection, the ability to touch someone's life in a meaningful way. Patricia, who had stayed to see Emma off, turned to Kenny. "You know, I've been interpreting for 20 years, and I don't think I've ever seen such genuine kindness between strangers. What you did tonight will change that young woman's life." "I think it might change mine too," Kenny replied quietly. 3 days later, Kenny received a video message from Emma. In it, she was sitting beside a hospital bed, where a young man who looked remarkably like her was propped up against pillows, looking tired but alert. Emma signed as she spoke aloud for Kenny's benefit. "This is my brother David. He wants to thank you for making sure I could be here with him. The surgery went perfectly, and he's going to make a full recovery. He says you're his hero." David, still weak from surgery but smiling broadly, signed something that Emma interpreted. He says that knowing his sister had someone kind helping her made him feel less alone, even before I got here. He wants to know if you'd like to be our friend. That simple video message began a correspondence that would profoundly change all their lives. Emma kept her promise about the website redesign, creating something that was not only visually stunning, but incorporated innovative features that made Kenny's online presence accessible to deaf and hard-of-hearing fans. She included video content in sign language, visual descriptions of his music, and information about accessibility at his concert venues. But more than a business arrangement, their interaction had sparked something deeper. Emma began teaching Kenny sign language via video calls, and Kenny found himself fascinated not just by the language itself, but by the rich culture and community it represented. "Most hearing people think being deaf is about what we can't do," Emma explained during one of their lessons, her hands moving gracefully as she signed while speaking aloud. "But deaf culture is incredibly rich. We have our own humor, our own ways of experiencing the world, our own art forms. Being deaf isn't a disability, it's a different way of being human." "How do you experience music?" Kenny asked, both signing and speaking as he had learned to do. Emma's face lit up with excitement. "Come to Denver sometime and I'll show you." 2 months later, Kenny took her up on that offer. He flew to Denver, where Emma and David had arranged for him to visit the Colorado School for the Deaf and Blind, the same school where he had been scheduled to perform the night their paths first crossed. What Kenny experienced there changed his understanding of music forever. Emma and David showed him how they heard music through vibrations, through visual representations, through the movement of interpreters who translated not just lyrics, but emotional content. They introduced him to deaf musicians who created incredible art using visual and tactile elements he had never imagined. "Put your hands here," Emma instructed, guiding Kenny's palms to the top of a large speaker. Then she played one of his own songs, "Lady." And Kenny felt his music in an entirely new way, experiencing the rhythm and bass line as physical sensations that traveled through his body. "This is how we experience your music," David explained through Emma's interpretation. "Through our hands, through the floor, through the vibrations in our chests. It's not the same as hearing, but it's beautiful in its own way." Kenny was profoundly moved by this experience. Here were people who experienced his life's work in a completely different way, finding beauty and meaning in aspects of music he had never considered. It made him think about all the deaf fans he'd encountered over the years. all the people who had been excluded from full participation in musical experiences simply because venues and artists didn't understand how to make their art accessible. That evening, as Kenny sat with Emma and David in their small apartment, an idea began forming in his mind. "Emma, David," he said, signing as he spoke, "would you be willing to help me with something that could change how concerts work for deaf people?" The siblings exchanged glances, intrigued by the possibilities in Kenny's voice. Kenny explained his vision: creating concert experiences that weren't just accessible to deaf audiences, but were designed from the ground up to include everyone. Not just sign language interpreters standing off to the side, but full sensory experiences that would allow people like Emma and David to feel the music, see it visualized, and participate fully in the community aspect of live performance. Emma's eyes widened as she understood the scope of what Kenny was proposing. "You want to revolutionize the entire concert experience?" "I want to make sure that nobody gets left out of the joy of live music," Kenny replied. "You've shown me that there are ways to experience music that I never imagined. Why should that be limited to schools and private settings?" Over the following months, Emma, David, and Kenny worked together to develop what they called the Silent Symphony Project. Emma brought her expertise in graphic design and her deep understanding of deaf culture. David contributed his knowledge of music theory and his experience as a deaf person navigating hearing environments. Kenny provided the industry connections and the platform to make real change happen. They started by retrofitting one of Kenny's own concerts. Emma designed visual systems that translated musical elements into light patterns and colors that followed the emotional arc of each song. David worked with sound engineers to create tactile feedback systems that allowed audience members to feel rhythms and bass lines through special seating and floor installations. Together, they collaborated with sign language interpreters to develop more dynamic and expressive ways of conveying not just lyrics, but the emotional and musical content of performances. The first Silent Symphony concert was held at the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville, a venue with deep historical significance in country music. Kenny performed a selection of his greatest hits, but the real innovation was in how the entire auditorium had been transformed into a multi-sensory experience. Emma stood at the side of the stage, not as a traditional interpreter, but as a conductor of the visual elements that brought Kenny's music to life for deaf audience members. Her hands moved in choreographed patterns that helped translate the emotional content of each song into something that could be seen and felt. David had positioned himself in the audience, monitoring the tactile systems and making real-time adjustments to ensure the vibrations enhanced rather than distracted from the performance. The response was overwhelming. Deaf audience members who had never been able to fully participate in a concert experience found themselves moved to tears, laughing at Kenny's between-song banter, which was being interpreted with full emotional content, and applauding with the same enthusiasm as hearing fans. Parents of deaf children wrote letters describing how their kids had experienced live music for the first time. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from the hearing audience members, who found that the visual and tactile elements enhanced their own experience of Kenny's music. The concert had achieved something rare. It had made the experience better for everyone, not just more accessible for some. Margaret Phillips, a music critic for the Nashville scene, wrote, "What Kenny Rogers and his collaborators have created isn't just an accessible concert, it's a new art form. By designing for inclusion, they've discovered possibilities that benefit every audience member. This is the future of live music." Word of the Silent Symphony project spread quickly through both the music industry and the deaf community. Other artists began reaching out to Emma, David, and Kenny, asking how they could make their own performances more inclusive. Venues started inquiring about installing the technology permanently. Music schools began developing curricula around accessible performance design. Kenny found himself becoming an unlikely advocate for disability rights, speaking at conferences and working with legislators to promote accessibility in entertainment venues. But he was always careful to credit Emma and David as the true visionaries behind the project. "I just provided the platform," he would say in interviews. "Emma and David provided the vision, the expertise, and the passion that made this possible. They taught me that inclusion isn't about adding something extra to accommodate people with disabilities. It's about recognizing that we've been designing experiences that unnecessarily exclude people and finding ways to welcome everyone." The project also brought Emma and David opportunities they had never imagined. Emma was invited to speak at design conferences about accessible technology and was offered consulting positions with major entertainment companies. David began working with music schools to develop programs for deaf musicians and was invited to perform his own compositions at venues that had implemented Silent Symphony technology. But perhaps more importantly, the friendship between Kenny and the siblings continued to deepen. Kenny became like a father figure to both Emma and David, offering guidance and support as they navigated their growing success. Emma and David helped Kenny see his own work through new eyes, understanding the power of music to bring people together across all kinds of differences. 1 year after their first meeting in the airport, Emma called Kenny with exciting news. She had been invited to design the accessibility features for a major music festival in Colorado, one that would feature both deaf and hearing performers on equal billing. "This is what we dreamed about," she signed during their video call. Deaf and hearing artists performing together, audiences that include everyone, technology that makes the experience richer for all participants. Kenny felt tears in his eyes as he watched Emma's excitement. "You've come so far from that scared young woman in the airport." "We've all come far," Emma replied, "but none of it would have happened if you hadn't decided to help a stranger." The Colorado Festival became a landmark event in accessible entertainment. For 3 days, deaf and hearing performers shared stages, audiences communicated across language barriers, and the Silent Symphony technology demonstrated its potential on a large scale. Major record labels sent representatives to scout deaf artists. Accessibility advocates from around the world attended to study the model for implementation in their own countries. During the festival's closing ceremony, Kenny took the stage with Emma and David for a special performance. As Kenny played guitar and sang "We Are the World," Emma provided sign language interpretation that was itself a form of performance art, while David conducted a visual light show that told the story of their journey from that chance meeting in an airport to this moment of celebration. The performance ended with the entire audience, deaf and hearing alike, participating in the visual applause of waving hands that Emma had taught them earlier in the festival. It was a moment of unity that transcended the usual boundaries between performer and audience, between different communities and different ways of experiencing the world. After the festival, as the three friends sat together in Emma and David's apartment, Kenny pulled out a small wrapped package. "I have something for both of you," he said, signing as he spoke. Emma and David opened the package together to find a custom-made music box. But instead of playing a traditional melody, it was designed to create visual patterns and vibrations that told the story of their friendship through touch and sight. "It's beautiful," Emma signed, tears in her eyes. "But why?" Kenny had prepared his answer in sign language, practicing for days to make sure he could express his feelings properly. "Because you taught me that the most important music isn't always the songs we perform on stage. It's the harmony we create when we choose to understand each other, to include each other, to see each other as fully human." David added his own thought. "You know what's amazing? Emma thought you were an airport employee that day. She thought helping passengers was literally your job." Kenny laughed. "In a way, she was right. Helping people connect, helping them reach each other, that's always been my real job. I just never understood it so clearly before." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. What had started as a simple act of kindness in an airport had grown into a movement that was changing the entertainment industry, creating new opportunities for thousands of people and demonstrating the power of human connection to overcome any barrier. 2 years later, the Silent Symphony project had been implemented in major venues across the United States and was beginning to expand internationally. Emma had established her own firm specializing in accessible experience design, while David had become a sought-after consultant on deaf culture in entertainment settings. Kenny continued to perform, but now every concert included the visual and tactile elements that made his music accessible to all audiences. More importantly, he had become a vocal advocate for universal design principles that benefited everyone, not just people with disabilities. The three friends were invited to speak at the United Nations about the power of inclusive design to build bridges between communities. As they stood before the assembly, Kenny speaking while Emma and David provided sign language interpretation, they represented the kind of partnership that transcends traditional boundaries. "Accessibility isn't a limitation or an accommodation," Kenny told the assembly. "It's an opportunity to be more creative, more thoughtful, and more human in how we approach our work. When we design for inclusion from the beginning, we don't just help people with disabilities, we create better experiences for everyone." Emma interpreted his words while adding her own perspective. "When someone takes the time to see you as a whole person, not just a problem to be solved or a special case to be accommodated, it changes everything. It changes how you see yourself, how you see your possibilities, and how you see your place in the world." David concluded their presentation. "What we've learned is that barriers between people are often artificial. When we remove those barriers, we don't just help the people who were being excluded. We discover new possibilities that benefit everyone. After their presentation, a young deaf boy approached them with his parents. He signed something to Emma, who translated for Kenny. He wants to know if he can be a musician when he grows up, even though he can't hear. Kenny knelt down to the boy's level and signed carefully. You can be anything you want to be. Your differences don't make you less capable. They make you differently capable. And sometimes being different is exactly what the world needs. The boy's face lit up with joy, and he signed back rapidly. Emma laughed as she translated. He says he's going to write songs that deaf people and hearing people can enjoy together, and he wants to perform at a silent symphony concert someday. I think that's the best idea I've heard all year, Kenny signed back. That evening, as Kenny, Emma, and David sat in a quiet cafe near the UN building, reflecting on the day's events, Emma pulled out the small notepad she still carried everywhere, the same one she had used to communicate with Kenny in the airport 3 years earlier. She wrote, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't helped me that day?" Kenny considered the question seriously before responding in sign language. "I think about it sometimes, but I also think we would have found each other eventually, in some other way. Some connections are just meant to happen." David nodded and signed. "Emma and I talk about this a lot. We think you were our guardian angel that day, sent to make sure we found our path." "Maybe we were all each other's guardian angels," Kenny signed back. "You certainly changed my life as much as I changed yours." It was true. Their friendship had not only led to the Silent Symphony project and their successful careers, but it had also given Kenny a new understanding of his own purpose. In his later years, when he might have been content to rest on his musical achievements, Emma and David had shown him that there was still important work to be done, still ways to use his platform and influence to make the world more inclusive and compassionate. The Silent Symphony project continued to evolve, eventually expanding beyond concerts to include accessible design for theaters, museums, educational institutions, and corporate events. The principles they had developed became standard practice in venue design, and the technology they had pioneered inspired innovations in fields far beyond entertainment. Dr. Sarah Chen, a researcher studying the project's impact, explained its broader significance. What Kenny, Emma, and David created goes far beyond making concerts accessible to deaf people. They've demonstrated that when we design for inclusion from the beginning, we create experiences that are richer, more engaging, and more meaningful for everyone involved. As Kenny approached his 80th birthday, he decided to organize a special concert that would showcase how far the Silent Symphony project had come. The event, held at Red Rocks Amphitheater in Colorado, featured deaf and hearing performers working together, cutting-edge accessibility technology, and an audience that represented the full spectrum of human diversity. Emma designed the visual elements for the concert, transforming the natural amphitheater into a canvas for Kenny's music. David conducted the tactile systems, ensuring that every audience member could feel the music through the stone beneath their feet. As Kenny performed songs from throughout his career, each one was accompanied by a multimedia experience that told stories visually, created emotional connections through touch, and celebrated the power of music to unite people across all differences. The concert's climax came when Kenny, Emma, and David performed together one final time. As Kenny played guitar and sang "Through the Years," Emma's sign language interpretation became a dance that told the story of their friendship, while David's visual design created a light show that represented the journey from isolation to connection, from misunderstanding to unity. The performance ended with the entire audience participating in the visual applause that had become the signature of Silent Symphony events. As thousands of hands waved in the mountain air, catching the setting sun, it created a moment of beauty that transcended language, hearing ability, and cultural differences. After the concert, as the three friends stood together on the stage looking out at the empty amphitheater, Kenny reflected on the journey that had brought them there. "You know," he said, signing as he spoke, "when I got into music originally, I thought success meant selling records and filling concert halls. But this, what we've built together, this feels like the most important thing I've ever done." Emma smiled and signed back. "It's not just what you've done, it's what we've done together. None of this would exist without all three of us." David added, "And it's not really about us anymore. It's about all the people who will never have to feel excluded from music because of what we started." As they left Red Rocks that evening, driving together through the Colorado mountains, Kenny thought about the words he had written in Emma's notepad so many years earlier. "We're all just walking each other home." Tonight it felt like they had indeed helped each other find their way home. Not to a place, but to an understanding of what it meant to live with purpose, to use whatever gifts and opportunities they had been given to make the world a little more inclusive, a little more compassionate, a little more connected. The Silent Symphony project continued to grow and evolve long after that final concert, touching millions of lives and fundamentally changing how society thought about accessibility and inclusion. But for Kenny, Emma, and David, it would always be remembered as the story of how a simple misunderstanding in an airport, when a country music legend was mistaken for an employee, led to a friendship that proved the most beautiful music happens when we choose to hear each other, see each other, and welcome each other exactly as we are.